My guest today is Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University and New York Times bestselling author of several books. Today, we're focusing on his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, and this is Bryan's second appearance on the Not Unreasonable podcast. Bryan, welcome.
Very much for having me, David.
So, first question. I did an interview with Mary Hirschfeld on her book, Aquinas and the Market. In that book, she, like you, critiques the rational choice theory. Rational choice theory being that the theory is saying in the aggregate, people make rational consumption decisions. And interestingly, this sort of gets used as a normative theory in the sense that it's a source of truth about what consumption decisions are right, or at least this is often how it is used. This is something, though, that I take both you and Mary to pretty strongly disagree with, though for very different reasons. Mary, who's also a theologian, really rejects this because she says people should prefer less economic growth in favor of non-economic pursuits. And you seem to reject the rational choice theory for the opposite reason, that we should prefer more of it. Am I right?
I would not say that you should maximize economic growth because that would require giving up weekends, for example, right? So it would require sleeping less, would require having less time for consumption. I will say that when you're thinking about desirable public policies, then the standard of what policies are best for growth is a reasonable one. You know, if you took it too literally, then it could lead you into a crazy path, but there's no free market country, or even let me use it like there's no non-totalitarian country where anyone has gone into the crazy land of destroying the quality of life in order to get higher growth. So you might say the Soviet Union did that for a while, where they basically just made life living hell on the theory this is going to increase the speed of economic development. But again, I'd say that for virtually any normal country, designing policy with an eye towards maximizing economic growth is a very reasonable approach.
I think that you use a pretty strong term, which is one of the things that I was kind of intrigued by through the book, which is calling it irrational to not have these preferences for, at least at the current margin, more economic growth. It's kind of one way of reading it, but maybe you could sort of defend your use of that very strong word, irrationality, here.
Right. So that's actually not what I say in the book. So economists have a longstanding distinction between beliefs and preferences. And really what I focus on in the book is beliefs. So a preference, it's philosophically, there's a lot more work in saying a preference is right or wrong. So it's like why, like chocolate ice cream, that's better than vanilla ice cream or something like that. On the other hand, for beliefs, the belief that this ice cream is chocolate, that belief can be argued, can be said to be rational or irrational. So actually in the book, what I really focus on is the rationality beliefs. And that's why I put in a lot of evidence on things that are popularly believed and yet are pretty clearly just not true. And that's actually where this question of aggregate errors is important. So again, there's a long-standing view in economics that, of course, people make mistakes, but still, if they're rational, there just won't be a pattern to the mistakes. And what I say is it's actually worse than that. Not only do people make big mistakes about important public policy issues, just in terms of the facts and how the world works, but on top of that, there's also the problem that there's a pattern to the errors. For example, the public, it's not that they simply have unpredictable views about trade, but rather they predictably think that international trade is bad. Right? And in a way that, if you really understand the subject, I would just say just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Okay, so the idea here is that there's a link. So it's not just about believing something is a good thing, but it's about believing something specific about that. So you can have this preference in saying, I don't like international trade for some reason. And if I'm understanding you right, you're saying that's okay. But if you don't like international trade because you think it lowers economic growth, that is wrong in a different category.
I say that's, first of all, that's wrong. And then secondly, I argue that generally that belief isn't just wrong, but it's actually irrational. And I've got a number of different ways of thinking about that. Again, one of them is just the pattern, just that it's so widely believed. Another one is that the reason why people that don't study the subject are so opposed to international trade, it doesn't seem like it's actually based upon a understanding of the textbook model, which then says, well, the textbook model misses something. Rather, it's just based upon impulsively deciding that you think that you've got it all figured out and then saying, I don't need to read the textbook. Why would I? And again, by the way, in that book, I will say that I was often thinking about my dad when I was thinking of the canonical irrational person. My dad's a very smart guy, very well educated, PhD in electrical engineering, yet he's never cracked an economics textbook. And he has very strong vociferous opinions. The fact that I'm a professor of the subject doesn't matter in the slightest to him. He just gets angry if you say, well, maybe you should go and calm down and at least be able to explain the arguments before you disagree with them. It's like, why would I need to do that?
That's pretty funny. And, it touches on a really important idea, I think, which is, and you mentioned it in the book yourself, where you're saying, before I studied economics, I didn't know this stuff either, right? And, and I think that there's this idea of these ideas, these sets of concepts being kind of not like directly intuitive. Maybe it is for some people, but there's an era before a lot of these economic truths were discovered, and there's an era after them. And so, like, I think of the irrationality as somehow being embedded in the human experience. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of stories you could tell about why the public inclines towards systematically false views. But I think that a big part of it is just deep set human emotions. For example, human beings naturally are inclined to blame foreigners for problems, even when this is clearly a silly thing to do. Right. And, if you just think about it emotionally, well, it's like, well, there's a problem. Well, who do I want to blame? Do I want to blame grandmas? No. Do I want to blame puppies? No. Do I want to blame foreigners? Ah, now that's one that really feels very pleasing. They're the kind of group where not only do people not feel bad about blaming them, but they actually feel pleased. Like, so, a group that I wasn't fond of to begin with is causing problems that are a danger to our society. Great.
And I think too, like and I read this year, as maybe you did too, Joe Henrich's book, "The Weirdest People in the World," and there's a variety of his work before that, which really brought this idea to bear on my mind of anti-market bias and anti-foreign bias being two of the four that you list in the book, and we'll probably talk about those as well. But those being actually really similar in the sense that they're, I think, what he calls like a I don't know, external pro-sociality or something, trusting people you don't know. And both of those instances, being anti-market and anti-foreign, you kind of have to trust the institutions and the systems around you to kind of have it work out, even though you don't know who this person is. So it feels to me like it's a pretty fundamental uh, piece of who we are.
Yeah. So there's probably something to that. Meaning, sort of my problem with that book is that appreciation of the value of trade is not it's not Western in any reasonable sense. So China had a great trading empire for millennia. So I mean, anyway, so again, it's to me, there's something odd about the Western label because I think that a lot of these ideas are actually not just somewhat present in other societies, but are very prominent in some other very important societies. But yeah, the general idea of trading with people at arm's length based upon mutual self-interest is much less emotionally appealing than one on trading with people that you personally know that you can just rely upon their good intentions.
Let's talk on the other two biases too. So you have so anti-market, anti-foreign, make work, and pessimistic bias. If you were to rank them, I mean, maybe we can play that game. What would you say are kind of the most to least?
Right. So out of the four, so I'd say probably the the anti-foreign bias is the one that currently does the most damage, just because particularly the international labor markets. I have another book on how much harm immigration restrictions do to the global economy. Basically by trapping labor in countries where it's unproductive. So I'd say that in the current time, anti-foreign bias is the most important one, followed by anti-market bias, followed by make-work bias, and then pessimistic bias is the one where it's least obvious exactly what it does to cause harm in the world. So we can speculate, but I would go anti-foreign, anti-market, and then finally make work with pessimistic last. I mean, I guess I would say that in earlier periods, that anti-market was more important, especially as long as the Soviet bloc was around. I would say that anti-market bias was doing more harm overall. But since the dissolution of that, I'd say that anti-foreign bias is the one that's really the continuing enormous drag on human flourishing.
Hey, where did you get the idea for these four biases? Was there a original source in the literature that kind of brought them up for you?
Right? No. So, I mean, I had read a lot of earlier economists. So, Frederick Bastiat is probably the most famous one. He was a French economist in the mid 19th century, and he just wrote about the contrast between the way that economists see the world and the way that normal people see the world, and said the general rule is that the views of the public, they're not just wrong, but they're just deeply confused and just hard to really make sense of when you state them, despite their great popularity. So Bastiat was a big inspiration. There's a number of other economists who've said similar things. And then finally, I spent a lot of time just looking at the data and saying, so do the stories that past economists have told about where the public goes wrong, where laymen go wrong, do they actually fit with the data that we have? And I said, yeah, overall, it does seem to look pretty good.
There's another interesting point you make early in the book, which really caught my eye and actually caused me to buy and read another book, which was Eric Hoffer's work, where he talked about mass movements being interchangeable, right? And I hadn't come across that before. That was pretty interesting. And there was something like deeply appealing to me about that idea because I see you tend to see mass movements arise in tandem in some ways, if nothing else, right? You have, I think of certainly in the recent political history where you have pretty radical right and left wing movements arising, and people who, in like a kind of anthropological sense, maybe are like really interchangeable to people. Like the people are, they're a little bit different, but really they're very similar kinds of people. And but for whatever accident of their own personal upbringing, they could have been on the other side of that, right? And that to me, I think is a pretty interesting piece of support for kind of all this being a universal thing as opposed to a political left and right thing. Do you think about left? You don't talk about left and right wing politics in the book very much, but do you see that interacting with you at all, or is it really just bigger than all that?
So I do talk about it a little bit. So what I'd say, looking at the data, is the left, as you'd expect, is more anti-market. The right is more anti-foreign, and then you can go into more details, but those are the two main patterns that I discuss. And I think so. I've got a co-author, Steve Miller, who goes over some other data and gets similar results on that. Um, yeah, so the main thing I was getting out of Eric Hoffer's The True Believer is just how politics is a religion. It's a truism now, but Eric Hoffer was one of the early people to say that the role that religion preserved in the earlier societies gets played by politics today. He's writing in, I think, the late 40s, early 50s, but seems like that's even stronger than it used to be. Very striking that even among conservatives, religion is in fairly steep decline in the United States. But this doesn't mean that the view goes away. It means that you change the view to rally around political views rather than religious ones. But especially the idea that there's a certain mindset that people have towards religious and political views where there's this desire for great fervor and passion and this premature certainty where people that really know next to nothing about even their own view, much less the competing views, will still act like they've got all the answers. So that was a big inspiration for this book. And of course, largely noting how angry many people get at really ideas that are quite commonsensical, just things like when you move an immigrant from Haiti to Florida, the productivity of the world goes up and by a lot. And people will get upset about that and say, look, like what part of that could really be wrong? Like if it's a Mexican farmer and you move him from Mexico to the U.S. and you say, look, we can just measure this guy produces 5 times as much food here. So he's contributing more to the world by being here than back at home. That's, it seems odd that someone would reject it. And yet most people would not only say that they disagree, but that they're angry about it.
Politics to me is a bigger thing than just what politicians do, right? So then people use this term of organizational politics as well, and I've just kind of always sort of wondered about the link between them because people talk about them using the same term, but it feels like they probably mean different things. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about what you mean by politics, maybe in conjunction with the religion, or how you see it as a more generally.
Yeah. Well, let's see. That's a good question. I mean, I guess that's fleshing out the analogy. You can say, well, so political ideology is very similar to theology. And so there's this body of doctrine that people repeat that gives meaning to their lives and that they're angry if you deny the truth of, even though they haven't really thought about it. And often it's even hard to explain how it could possibly be right. There's also the social element, right? So people attend church, it's their club, it gives them their network of friends and allies. And the same thing goes with politics, where people today use their political party as a filter for who's worthy to be a friend. They might actually lose friends based upon a political disagreement. So you've got that. And then obviously there's also this hierarchy where within a church you have as the spokesman for the view, and they're also the natural leaders of the group, and then in politics, it's professional politicians, pundits, talking heads that serve the same role as clergy. So yeah, so I mean, I'd say that all of that's going on.
Hmm. I think of like politics. I have more experience with organizational politics myself, and I think of it as kind of like this collective decision making
Mm-hmm.
process. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Mary Douglas. You ever come across that name? So she's an anthropologist.
No, I don't think so,
So
actually.
she's an anthropologist of, she passed away, I think, around 2001 or something. But she worked on these ideas of how risk interacts with culture, and so she had a book called Risk and
Mm-hmm.
Purity. I think no, Purity and Danger, where there's an idea of pollution, and that is people develop these norms for getting for enforcing the rules of their society by inventing stories about why things go wrong. And so you think of like in primitive societies,
Mm-hmm.
you can only understand so much of reason why things happen, but everything gets interpreted politically. So natural disasters, it's like, oh, this person violated some incest taboo or whatever, right? So using it to enforce the norms of society. And to her, politics are really a mechanism for handling uncertainty, or a mechanism for interpreting uncertainty and dealing with it. And so like a political vision gets 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 gives given voice to, right? So a politician or political entrepreneur, is a term people use, will say, here's a vision of the future, and here's how we're going to get there, and you don't have to worry about any of these other details because I've got it, right? And to me, that interacts with your work, I think. In maybe sometimes, you make the point in your book, where some politicians can really emphasize these biases, right, and pander to the biases of society, and some can actually chart a different path. But
Some, I mean, I would say almost all successful ones anyway.
yeah, well, I mean, but there's this interesting, at the same time, like we do have progress, right? So, like, there surely are good politicians in the sense that you would agree with in the spirit of your book, who actually enable something in advancement, because we're clearly, our society is better than it was some centuries ago. So there has been progress from time to time. So there is such a thing as a good politician, right?
I would say, like less bad rather than
Okay.
good. I mean, like it's just so hard for someone to gain power without pandering to absurdities. I mean, again, like to me, like people think like, is there some kind of political agenda here? And I say, look, just listen to any politician from a society other than your own, and just see how their whole way of thinking about things is
Mm.
corrupt. It's one where they're trying to go and tell a story that sounds good. They're trying to make friends. Again, like for a politician to say, well, look, here's what people want to believe, but it's not true. Here's the actual ugly truth. Politicians don't want to say that. They want things to work
Yeah.
out so that like again, like it's theological, right? I mean, I do like this analogy between politics and doing human sacrifices to make the weather work, because I think that's a lot of what's actually going on is there's things that are just irrelevant or harmful being done in order to cause things that, if good, would have happened anyway. There's not a lot of effort to really test whether or not the claims are true. There's anger even at questioning, and demonization at those who do ask questions. So, like main thing to remember is that you know, as long as you've got technological innovation, business innovation, there could be a lot of bad things the government is doing to mess it up, and still you come out ahead. So again, like you might say, well, let's just give politicians credit for not totally strangling progress. All right, I'll give them one cheer for that. Congratulations, you didn't totally strangle progress. I really appreciate your sacrifice there. Same time, you'll detect the sarcasm that I have, because say, look, you could have done a lot better. It's just that it wasn't conducive to your pursuit of power.
Who's your favorite politician of all time, in the spirit of the book?
My favorite U.S. president is probably Grover Cleveland.
Okay.
Uh, so I think that he just appeared in the news recently for irrelevant reasons. So it's got my sympathy for Cleveland has very little to do with this. You know, one of the like, he was just noted for not only his promotion of what I think of as good economic policies, but he also was just willing to go and say things that were very unpopular. Things like, look, we could go and use government to go and solve all these problems, but it's just a very bad idea. And like he was notable also, like when he said, like, I'll go and make a charitable donation, but I'm not going to go and use taxpayer money for this problem. So do appreciate that. But so, like, in terms of good things, so I mean, like the problem honestly is that politicians that get a lot of attention are usually ones that do new things, and
Hmm.
I would say that usually that's for the worst. In terms of politicians that actually ultimately accomplished a lot of good, I want to say Gorbachev, but again, not because I think he actually was a really good guy, but he just botched his own effort to reform communism while retaining power. So I mean, like he, like things were great things occurred because of him, but again, I would not want to actually give him the credit in any wholehearted sense. So again, like one cheer for Gorbachev, or again, like similarly, actually, Deng Xiaoping, like he actually took one of the most grotesque, horrifying economic systems in human history and turned it into a tolerable one.
Hmm.
Right. At the same time, he was complicit in horrible crimes against humanity during earlier in his career. So, but in terms of like people who've done the most good, Deng Xiaoping, who basically spearheaded the reprivatization of agriculture in China and the general opening up and free market reforms, uh, you, definitely just accomplished a lot, but still really a bad guy. And
Yeah.
so that's I mean, again, I wish I had a better answer. If I thought about it for a long time, I probably could come up with one. Um, like when I think about it more, I'm tempted to think like blessed are the peacemakers, and then like which leaders did the most to swallow their pride to actually durably settle a international like international conflict. So again, that's one where like the ones that start conflicts are much more famous than the ones that settle them.
Hmm.
So it makes it
Well,
tough.
there's maybe like a model here, which is, if the book is right, I'll say that. Then maybe you need to look for the unpopular politicians, and
Yeah, yeah.
that list. Maybe that'd be a better list for you.
Although like it can't be so unpopular they don't actually have power, or
Right.
else they don't do anything there either.
Right. Yeah.
So, right, or like alternately, there's the ones where their policies are unpopular, but they have such a great personality that they win people over to them anyway.
Hmm.
So, um, again, like I'm not far from a huge Ronald Reagan fan, but he did do a number of things that I think were very good policy reforms. And I think that in terms of the actual policies that he adopted, that they probably were not that popular, but he just had such a winsome personality that he was able to get things done. That other people, there's someone else with the same views and maybe was smarter and more articulate, wouldn't have been able to accomplish.
So what is the theory of progress then that's implied by this book? Because it's
Yeah.
pretty
Mm-hmm.
pessimistic. So politicians are bumbling around and messing it up all the time, and they're in charge, right? Two pretty big assumptions, but let's you can dispute those if you like. Then how do we improve in spite of it?
So, like, a very big part of it is in the modern world, technological and managerial progress have so much momentum behind them that there can be a lot of headwinds caused by politics, and yet things keep improving. Right. So, think about this. So, like for all of the major tech improvements, if each of them were only allowed if there had been a vote by both houses of Congress and that was signed by the president, how much progress would have occurred?
Right.
Right? Very little. But fortunately, you have a system where the status quo is you can do things, and then it takes effort to stop them. And so I think a lot of progress is caused by politicians being too off the ball to actually prevent improvements from happening, right? And you can really see what this would be like generally by looking at how botched the vaccine approval and distribution process has been. So if everything were as regulated as vaccines, then everything would go about as well as that. Although even there, you might say, well, at least we got a vaccine. You say, yeah, well, that's again the momentum of technology
Mm.
that is so strong that it's able to overcome a really disastrous system of regulation. So yes, just to let you know what I have in mind here, uh, you know, there's a very simple economic reform that could have gotten us these vaccines 6 to 8 months earlier. And that reform is allowing voluntary paid human experimentation. All right. So the way that the actual vaccines were tested was they got a sample of people, half got it, half got a placebo, and then just waited around 6 months to see who got sick and then measure the difference. That is not a good way to rapidly find out whether a vaccine works. The good way to do it is to give them the vaccine and then a week later inject them with the disease. And then within a month how well the vaccine works instead of having to wait all that time. Right. And if that occurred, then these vaccines could have been approved much earlier. But so, like, why wasn't this done? And I think that if you think about it a little bit, you know why it wasn't done, which is that no politician wants to stick their necks out and take responsibility for doing something that sounds so ghoulish and bad and Joseph Mengele like and everything else. And even you say, look, it's nothing like, it's the opposite of Mengele. This is voluntary human experimentation. It's not involuntary. It's the difference between consensual sex and rape. But that is not, so those are not words that a politician wants to actually say. Right. And like this is all backed by the bioethical community with this absurd view that you can't give true informed consent if the disease is new. It's like, how about you tell them, hey, this is a new disease. So there could be some unknown things that could be really bad for you. Do you still want to do it? Here's $10,000. Right. So that is a really simple economic mechanism for speeding the approval process through. Right. And then, of course, right now we have a terrible distribution system managed by governments instead of just allowing the market to work. And it's like, sell people the vaccine, right? So that it doesn't go to waste. And there are strong incentives to get it into as many arms as possible, as quickly as possible. So, yeah, I mean, actually, if I were redoing the section on anti-market bias today, I would probably actually just do a bunch of COVID examples because we have this bizarre aversion to letting people volunteer to be injected by the disease, not just for the money, but for the good of mankind, right? Like basically you're saying, yes, so you're not allowed to be a hero. Too bad, right? And, hundreds of thousands of lives lost because of this delay, but people are very stubborn about it. They don't want to pay people, right? And then similarly, people get so agitated about the idea of a rich guy getting the vaccine first that they'd rather that a lot of the vaccine just get wasted. And so,
yeah, and people die.
Ridiculous.
It
Yeah.
feels to me like,
But anyway, but the reason I bring this example up is just to see how you can have terrible government policy, but progress still happens because the technology is so forced. There's so much momentum in technology that it happens despite the bad policy. So that's a lot of it. I have another story that part of what voters do is they blame politicians for having unpopular policies. Another thing they do, though, is blame them for disaster. And this means that politicians at least have to think about, well, should I do something unpopular if the consequences will be good enough? I'm not saying this generally leads to good policies happening, but at least it is a way that political incentives somewhat dilute the incentives to deliver bad policy all the time.
yeah, there's a paper somewhere. There's a concept that you touch on in the book called retrospective voting, pocketbook voting,
Yes.
right? We talk about that, but the idea of kind of recent events really enormously impacting people's their vote. And there's and I was looking at the paper, I forgot the name of the author, who you can tell me, but they also wrote a paper about how shark attacks really hurt the prospects of some president or something. Tell us about pocketbook voting.
Right. So pocketbook voting, or more generally retrospective voting, is when voters, instead of having theories about what policies are good or bad, they just look at what's been happening since the last politician got in power. And peace and prosperity, all right, good, reelect him. War and poverty, bad, throw the bum out. Right. This is a voting strategy which, if adopted, would be a tremendous improvement over the status quo because it's really easy to do. It's much less of a philosophical or ideological question just to look at the world and say what's going on. Right now, you might say, well, it's perfect because maybe a politician got unlucky. So yes, it is imperfect, but it's a lot less imperfect than the current one where voters figure out for themselves what policies are good based upon what? Nothing. Based upon their gut, based upon what sounds good, based upon like poetry, right? So far better to have an imperfect measure of political performance that actually does track the good performance rather than what we currently do, which is quite bad. Now, again, like I said, there's people do a bit of this. Basically, I would say that the simplest strategy the voters could adopt to get much better government would just be to do full retrospective voting and be agnostic about policy and just say, look, if the country is at peace and getting rich quick under your rule, then I'm going to reelect you, and otherwise, I'm not going to listen to a word you say.
So it sounds to me like you do not believe retrospective voting is real.
So it happens to a modest extent. It's
Okay.
just that it's only a modest part of what's going on. And on top of it, there's also another problem, which is that in the real world, people's ideology actually strongly affects their view about what's happening. So if your party's in charge, you just tend to think the economy's doing better than people that aren't committed to a party. right? So, and again, particularly you can say, look, the objective performance measure is the same, but when your party's in charge, you say things are better.
Mm-hmm. I, I feel like at kind of like a margin, right? So you think about if if each party, they got the vote that's in the bag, right? So the marginal voter is probably maybe more sensitive in retrospective sense. Would you agree with that? And so the force of because one of the questions I had for you was, if you had in the race or the fight between, biased voting and retrospective voting, which one's more important to actual election outcomes? It's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So again, I would say that the retrospective voting is less important, but it does matter at the margin. So, meaning now the idea that marginal voters are more retrospective than regular voters, it sounds true, but I don't know of any evidence that actually confirms that. I mean, here's the thing: is that marginal voters are also super uninformed and very, and also also just very very emotional. So um, it's just not clear that they actually are better. So again, like in other words, like you want to swing voters, you might actually be better off going and talking about flag burning.
Uh, I guess so. Um, another kind of thing that was really came to mind of talking about pocketbook voting, retrospective voting, is how it interacts with the self-interested voter hypothesis. Because we talk about that in a second about definition and some of the critiques of it, or the devastating critiques of it. But it feels to me like a pocketbook vote is actually kind of a self-interested vote. Am I getting that right? You think? What do you think?
Right. So I actually know. Well, like one of the main ways people have tested self-interested voting is to see if we race the economic performance, say, of the country versus your own economic performance, which one is more predictive. And a standard result is that actually the economic performance of the country is quite a bit more predictive of people's votes than their own performance. So basically, if unemployment is low but you're out of a job, you still will tend to reelect the incumbent.
Funny.
And on the other
Weird.
hand, if unemployment is high but you're doing really well, you'll still tend to vote against the incumbent. So there's not only is there no necessary connection between self-interested voting and retrospective voting, but actually one of the main tests of self-interested voting is to see if we do a race of these two stories, which one works. And it seems like the social well-being story is one that wins.
That's amazing, and as you make a big point of in the book, rightly so, is that runs counter to a lot of what we think, or at least we think
Yeah.
other people vote on the basis of.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say it would probably be better if everyone just voted selfishly based upon their firsthand experience, because it's a lot harder to be wrong about firsthand experience than about the overall level. Ideology determines what you think, or ideology heavily affects how you think the country's doing. But on the other hand, how you think you're doing, that's very heavily based upon how you actually are doing.
And you make the point too that we actually assume other people vote in a self-interested way,
Yeah,
even though we ourselves do not.
right. Yeah, so this is one that is very striking to me. So, if you ask people, so why do your political opponents vote the way that they do? One of the most standard stories is, well, because they're just selfish. They don't care about society. All they care about is themselves. But here's what's really striking to me. I've sometimes asked people, all right, but why are the people on your side? Why do they back your side? You might think people would be bending over backwards to say that their political allies are unselfish. But in my experience, they don't. So, like, if you go and ask I say like an academic, left wing Democrat, why is it you think that, say, you, let's see, why do you think that Hispanics are more democratic? Now, they rarely do they say, oh, well, because Hispanics care more about justice than white people. Instead, they say, well, because Democrats do more stuff for them, right? And now you might say, well, people are, say, well, but why are you a Democrat? So they say, oh, well, because I'm idealistic. I care about society. Right now, you might think that the real story here is that everybody's selfish and that people are overrating themselves. But I say when you look at the data, really the story is it seems like in a sense people are rightly rating themselves and they are underrating everybody else, both not only their opponents but also their allies.
Yeah, I wonder if I could also see if I can get you to agree with me that retrospective is a little bit better than maybe you think, or at least you're saying here. Because I sense in the book that you were a little more positive about it than I'm hearing now. But let me kind of give you an example of something that really struck me, which maybe you even wrote about. But so if you look at NAFTA, right, enacted in the I think in the 80s, early 90s. Yeah, and I'm from Canada. And it was Brian Mulroney in Canada by the time I do remember it, and kind of amazing event, right? One that I think that the anti-market and anti-foreign bias would both work against, but it happened. So that's an interesting episode in and of itself. And then you had this other event, which happened a couple of years ago when President Trump repealed it and then basically reenacted it under a different, less memorable name. So maybe it was less prominent or something. So that like there's some serious like persistence there. And I'm wondering if it's just because the thing worked that they knew it was going to work and it came out as expected. And so they can't really get rid of it because that would be bad. Because then we would trigger a retrospective cascade here and hurt our how do you interpret NAFTA and the USMCA or whatever it's called now?
Yeah. So what I would say there was, so like now that it's existed for a long time, it would be devastating for especially a bunch of border states if it were repealed. So I think
Yep.
that not so it could be voters would get angry. Again, I think it's more about special interests getting angry, right? And special interests, of course, can inadvertently do good things, and I think this is such a case. So you have a lot of business there, and they do have political influence, and so they would actually be very upset if NAFTA were genuinely repealed. So I think that is a big part of it. Uh, so in terms of how NAFTA happened in the first place, and the book I do talk about public opinion, where basically the one time when support for NAFTA exceeded opposition was the first poll that was done after it passed, and then it very quickly became unpopular again.
Yeah.
So as to what was going on there, you might say that the improvement in the economy helped Clinton more than the resentment of the particular policy, possibly. Just the main thing I would say is that there are think about all the NAFTAs that could have been that didn't happen, right? And then I think you do get an idea about how much waste is really going on. The other thing I would say is there has been some good research on the link between policy and public opinion, and one of the main results is that existing is worth about 20 percentage points of public support. So if something exists and 40% of the public supports it, it's about as likely to last or to exist as if it doesn't exist and 60% of the public supports it. So that is something else where the system favors the status quo, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
familiar psychological stories about why that would be true. So like the idea that Trump would have passed a NAFTA if it hadn't existed, I think that's quite fanciful. That wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. That's probably pretty easier to agree with. To me, like the thread that runs through a lot of this is uncertainty, where like it's a bird in hand when you have something that exists. It's like, well, change is just kind of scary, and I think usually people kind of invoke that idea in kind of the negative sense and say, well, people don't like change, and that's like that, therefore they're stupid. But I mean, I don't really agree with that because like often, obviously there are certain changes which I believe are positive, but for the most part, it's the devil you don't know is the one that's going to come. We just moved into a new house here, right? In the old house, we had ants in the house, right? And here, like, I was like, oh, thank God, no ants, right? And then turns out actually there's a mouse living in the basement, and it's like, well, like we didn't know that was going to be the case, but when you make a change, like a lot of things are going to change, and they're not always going to be positive, and some are going to be negative. So to me, it's like quite prudent, maybe rational. I don't know if that's quite the right kind of like word to invoke for it, but it's prudent to be wary of change because you just don't know what's going to happen next.
Totally reasonable point, actually. Yes, it is prudent to be nervous about change, right? And if when economists talk to the public about reforms, if that were the main objection, I would actually feel a lot better about people, right? Because if someone says, well, look, I'm just nervous about change, that's where you say, all right, fine, let's do a test program. Let's do a pilot. Let's do it on a small scale and keep an open mind and see what happens. The number of people that you can persuade with that idea is close to zero. So, so that which I think really does tell you something about how crazy people are about politics. Like an argument that would actually make sense, would be reasonable. Saying, look, this sounds good, but like the status quo seems okay to me, and like this could turn out to be really bad. That's one where it's actually it's an objection where you can say, all right, fine, let's sit down and try to discuss your fears, and let's go and try to see, will you give me a chance here to go and try it on a small scale, right? So that's what's quite striking is just how few people you will ever meet who will just have that view. So instead, the normal reaction when we talk about change is not, I don't want to do it all in one step. Like we don't know enough. Let's go and try it on a small scale. Instead, normally people just bite your head off. So,
Yeah, yeah. The one spot in the book where you kind of tangle with the idea of uncertainty. By training, I'm an actuary, right? And I work in the insurance industry, and so like to me, like I have a little bit of a drum I'm kind of beating all the time about risk being kind of underrated in a kind of weird sense. But you make mention of this paper by Roderick and Fernandez, who actually incorporate quite directly this idea of risk in an explanation for why a lot of economic policies that are pretty well accepted in the economic mainstream are not enacted by politicians. You're kind of dismissive of it, but you didn't really dig into it in detail. And I'm wondering, if you could, talk a bit about what you find unappealing about that argument.
sure. So it's a quite technical argument, which is part of why I consider it so ridiculous, because it requires a level of intellectual subtlety on behalf, like in the public, that just is, to my mind, crazy. So, but again, like basically what they want to show in that is how policies could be unpopular before they actually get adopted, and yet could be popular if they after they get adopted, without having anyone actually change the preferences or learn anything. Learn anything fundamental. So basically, they say, all right, so imagine that there's a reform, and 40% of the population knows that they will lose for sure from it. And then out of the remaining 60%, there are, let's see, so out of the remaining 60%, let's see, so,
I think it was 40% were going to win, and of the remaining 60%,
yeah, yeah,
it was like a third of them was
yeah,
going to win, or
that's
there's
right.
a one third probability.
Yeah,
And so if you take like the expected value,
yeah.
but because
Yeah,
yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So suppose there's a reform, 40% of people will definitely gain, but 60% say, well, there's a two-third chance that I lose, one-third chance that I gain. And then if
right.
you go and do this, then 60% will vote against the policy. But if you adopt the policy, then all 40% of the people that knew they would gain still support it, plus a third of the 60% will now know that they gained from it. And so now 60% will support the continuation of it. So again, this is a cute little story, and it's a fun exercise for probabilistic reasoning. But again, I just say that's not anywhere close to how like any policy I've ever heard of. Actually, that's just not the way, not the way that people talk about these policies, not the way they reason about them.
I was kind of all over the place as I was kind of thinking about that argument because you know I I agree that certainly as presented, it's kind of like technical and I agree with you. Like probabilistic reasoning is. I mean, listen, I'm an actuary, so how critical can I be of it? But I think that uh, for the most part, people don't probably explicitly go through a process like that, right? I mean, certainly they don't. But if the idea here is that there's a range of outcomes, there's a confidence interval, and how this is going to impact me, and I don't like confidence intervals, so I don't want it. And that intuition I find appealing. They don't state that at all in their paper in that kind of way, but I do kind of get that, right? If I don't
Well,
know
I mean,
what's
over
going to
there, I
happen,
would say
then
there's a confidence interval for how the status quo is affecting you too. Right? So again, that would take us back to why aren't there more people who, when presented with a policy reform, just say, I don't want to try this on a big scale. Let's try it on a small scale and see what happens. Then again, this is so unusual for a normal person to say this. I mean, even if you go and prompt people, most people will not go along. But for the odds that a randomly selected voter will spontaneously, without leading the witness, say, I don't want to try this on a big scale, but let's try it on a small scale so we can learn whether it works. Very unusual. Now, of course, by the way, this was actually one of the earliest arguments for federalism, was to have a bunch of laboratories of democracy so we can easily compare. And this is reason that many people gave for why the federal government should have very little power, is because we want to be able to look to just have a wide diversity policy, and we can learn from success and learn from failure. But again, if you were to go and propose this and say, let's devolve things to the federal from the federal level to state level so we can learn more, again, hardly anyone is going to go along with that. So basically, if their party's in power and they say, look, we know what's going on, we don't need to learning, bah. You say, like, how can you say you don't need to learn? The world's really complicated. It's like, no, it's not. I'm going to all figure it out. And this is just, you're just trying to go and deprive us of the fruits of victory by telling us we can't make the whole country do what we have figured out is great.
I think too, though, if you like come back to Deng Xiaoping, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't come up with the idea of market liberalization, right? He was quite explicitly copying many countries that were succeeding, and so I think the idea of mimicry is really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. And although, like, important thing to realize is that if that Chinese power struggle had gone a little bit differently, China could be still under a Maoist type regime even now, right? Like if you know the details of it, it was very touch and go for a while. Like really,
Mhm.
if Mao had just before he had died had just ordered execution of a bunch of Deng Xiaoping and a bunch of similar people, then Mao's wife could have taken over. And I think she was quite a bit younger. She could have just continued the carnage for decades further.
Yeah, I mean that point taken. What I'm trying to get at is like the idea of countries being experiments for each other, right? So in the United States, achieving remarkable success in one area or another, or other countries for that matter, can
Yeah.
and come up with policies that we adopt here,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So they can, and once in a long while they do. Although this is also something, like I did a blog post on this. So after World War II, there were a whole lot of countries that copied the Soviet Union, right? Despite it being one of the most disastrous economic models in human history. Basically, it's a good way to build up a giant military while starving your population, right? If that's your goal, then follow Stalin. But on the other hand, the number of countries that were like a number of political movements that were influential on Earth after World War II that said, let's try to make our country as much as possible like the United States. It's hard to find any such movements. Right. So basically, it's like either follow the Soviet model or follow some indigenous model. We don't want like we here in Afghanistan, we shouldn't follow any external model, any foreign model. We should do it the Afghan way. And it's like, well, the Afghan way doesn't seem to have been very good so far, does it? So like, why would you want to continue in that model? But like to like it'd be like because of this anti-foreign bias and just this ideology of nationalism, it just burns people's pride to go and emulate a successful country. It does happen occasionally. In a way, a lot of what it takes to emulate successful countries is to get a very rhetorically skillful leader who basically will sugarcoat everything and say, no, we're not copying the United States. This is the true Afghan way. And just, well, if you can just go and snow people that way, then maybe you can get some good stuff through.
And that happens, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
make quite a lot of points in the book about how politicians shirk in
yeah, yeah.
all kinds of
Oh
ways, right? So it's very normal.
yeah. Yes. Like shirking in general is normal. Shirking to go and set aside failed economic models and favor more successful ones based on mimicry does happen, but again, it's quite rare. Unfortunately,
And they're snapping back, though. You make the point about people adopting the Soviet Union's norms. I mean, the Soviet Union themselves,
yeah. So again,
who
like I say
came apart.
there, even though the model itself was a disaster, but the rhetoric was so romantic, so emotionally appealing that it's not surprising that it actually had so much power. I mean, again, like just say, look, the people should rule this. Everything should be shared by everyone in common. That kind of thing. That sounds great to people, right? So, I mean, I remember, there's this old test of political knowledge, and the question was, does I think it's true or false? The phrase "from each according to his ability, to each according to his need" appears in the Constitution, right? Of course, it doesn't. It's in Karl Marx. And I think it was Noam Chomsky who said, well, it's a reasonable mistake because that's such a great idea. All right. It's like, no, it's not a great idea. It's an idea that sounds good. Very different from actually being a great idea. Right. So, like there are ideas that are terrible that sound good. There's ideas that that are great but sound bad. Things like voluntary paid human experimentation to go and speed up the approval of COVID vaccine. That sounds terrible to normal people, but it's a fantastic idea. Right. Like it's one where I would just say, like, if you can't see that that's a good idea, I just can't imagine what's wrong with you that to sit there like saying no, no. Like, like they consented. It will save hundreds of thousands of lives. Just put this squeamishness aside and get on board. I mean, that's one where actually I was daydreaming. Like, if I was president, I would just say, look, we're doing this. Is there anyone that disagrees? If so, you must resign. I will not be in the same room with someone that is not on board with this absolutely essential,
Yep.
totally logically bulletproof idea.
And it reminds me of like there's appeal to you're right to like expertise and authority, which you're unabashedly invoking here, which doesn't always go well, right? I mean, your point about you just made the point the Soviet Union and in China, like when you have a lot of authority concentrated in a smaller space, you get some diverse outcomes.
Well, I mean, some actually very predictable outcomes. This is one rising. Part of it is, of course, conservation authority. Another one is that violent fanatics seize control of the country. So and ruled until they died.
Yeah, and that's pretty common. But you see urgings towards moving more collectivist, and I think that what's this is the part about your book that kind of like most got me to wondering is like what is kind of alternative, because like to our current state. And you touch on a few ideas and maybe you can talk about them a little bit now. But in a world where you're concentrating authority in any way, you introduce this risk of picking the wrong authority, right?
So, I mean, when I see in the book, first thing is, like step one is just admitting that you have a problem. So, step one is to say just because an idea is popular doesn't mean it's true, right? And not just pro forma, but to like really internalize that thought and say, look, like, yes, this idea, like people like it, but is it true, right? And instead of
Yeah.
biting people's heads off for second guessing the people to say, well, look, this is the question we should always be asking, like what's actually true. So that's one thing I say. Then I talk about a number of other structural reforms. Things like I suggest there could be you could give the Council of Economic Advisors the same kind of power the Supreme Court has. So the Supreme Court can say a law is unconstitutional. The Council of Economic Advisors could rule that a law is uneconomical and therefore gets invalidated. Right now, this sounds like science fiction, and I agree it is, because there is a catch-22 with a lot of institutional reforms, which is the whole point of the institutional reforms is to change the policies that exist, and yet the policies that exist are there because people think they're a good idea. So there's that. I do just talk about better education and trying to communicate economic ideas and just rational thinking more effectively. I mean, obviously that is a horrible uphill battle. I mean, again, like some things that I think would make a big difference, just to go and spread the norm of retrospective voting, and just to say, look, be agnostic about policy, vote based on actual observed results rather than a grand theory, which you're not really able to figure out. It's too hard, so that would be an improvement. Um, so I'd say there's a lot of ways to improve on things. I mean, the main problem again is that they generally are fixes that people are not interested in because they think they're right.
There's a critique that I heard recently that I really found fascinating, which is, as I've forgotten where it came from, but the the pundit was saying that in the intellectual circles in China, the pro-communist ones, I would suppose, they
Mm-hmm.
have this critique of our governance system here, which is that it maximizes dissent, because the way the two-party system is set up, you're naturally going to move the ideological line, to where it exactly slices the population in half, because the parties are, well, I mean, it's obviously not the case, right? But like near enough to that, where the only have to carry 51% of the people to win, and so you're more likely to carry the 51% if you don't go for 60, because you don't have to water down the stuff that irritates the extremists and you risk divisiveness in the party. So like kind of like the internal cohesively maximizing strategy is to only go for 51%, which means that you necessarily are splitting all the issues up. And by maximizing disagreement, you in a sense can never agree on anything. I wonder if you ever heard this, or what do you think about that?
Yeah. So you could fix that story to make it true, but as you stated it, I don't think it could be right. So, I mean, essentially, what you're describing is what's called the median voter theorem, where politicians moderate in order to win, right? But again, like the result of that model is the exact opposite. Basically, both parties wind up being almost identical, and they then adopt middle of the road policies, which are at least not very far from what most people want.
Mm.
In order for to get the story of having strong disagreement, you need the parties to be worried about losing their extremists, and so each party basically refuses to compromise, refuses to move the center in order to keep their extremists on board. So that is a very different model. That one would give you this result.
Do you think that's what's happening? Because it feels kind of like, well, people talk about that is what kind of is happening in the
Yeah, so,
press. I don't
so
know if
again,
that.
like my own view is actually it's different for both these stories. I think what's really going on is that the main kind of polarization we have, it's not so much issue polarization as mutual antipathy or hatred, right? So here's the thing: you could have two very moderate politicians who still make their small differences into a matter of life and death. And I think that's a lot more of what we have in the U.S. is what you call tyranny of small differences, where again, like the actual difference in view between the typical Democrat and typical Republican on the minimum wage is fairly small. like only large majorities of both groups think that there should be a minimum wage. It's a disagreement about whether the existing minimum wage is high enough or whether it should be raised a bit. Right now, you might think that if that's your only disagreement, you wouldn't actually be angry at each other. But human nature allows people to hate each other and demonize each other, even when the differences between them are quite modest and marginal. My favorite example here, of course, is the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, where to anyone who is just not a Christian, it's like, it's the same book, it's the same religion. These differences are totally trivial. But that doesn't stop them from drowning Europe in blood for a century over differences that to any neutral bystander are not very important. And again, I would say that despite the extreme antipathy that Democrats and Republicans now bear towards each other, and there is good data bearing this out, in particular, in the 60s, hardly anyone cared whether someone from their own family married someone from the other party. They've been doing the survey. And now it's actually one of the most objectionable things is for your family member to cross party lines when they marry. So that does suggest a degree of just disgust and resentment of the other. But in terms of actual policy views, if you were to go and just do a survey of world opinion on policy, American Democrats and Republicans would be very close to each other by global standards. It's like, yes, we don't want Sharia. Sharia's popular in a lot of countries. Hardly anyone here wants it. Right? And just go down the line for policies. You'll see that if you have a reasonably broad view of what policies are possible, you'll see that the American Democrats and Republicans are very close together, but that doesn't stop them from hating each other and just like with a passion any more than the fact that Catholicism, Protestantism are virtually the same, stop them from hating each other, or Sunni and Shia Islam are basically the same, but doesn't stop them from hating and killing each other. So that's what I think is going on.
So, do you think that is it completely irrelevant to the theme of the book? So, is this just a total sideshow and an independent kind of like development?
Right. Well, I would say that it fits in with the general theme of politics being the religion of modernity. I wouldn't say that the model specifically predicts this. It couldn't because this wasn't true 50 years ago. So, I guess what I would say is that the model is, like once you say that people are rational, then you should at least be open to the possibility that they might be really upset about some marginal differences.
Yeah. So we're out of time here, Bryan, but maybe you can strike an optimistic note for me. What can we say that's positive? I mean, things are better. Are they getting better? No.
So, 2020 is the one year in my life where I'm very confident things got worse for the world.
Sure.
So, like it happens, right? Like my view is actually the disease itself was quite modest by historic standards. Spanish flu, properly measured, was probably like 100 times as bad. But the policy reaction was so extreme that, and in my view, such an overreaction that it was really quite disastrous. But you're asking for a positive note. I guess my view of positive note is just to say, step back and look out your window. Is the world on fire? It's not. So be grateful for that. The world's not on fire. Right. And then just to say, consider like other places around the world where you might be, consider other times that you might have been born, and realize that by those standards, things are quite good. So I appreciate that. And also to just tell people, remember, like politics is not life. So while you can make it into your life and spend all of your time looking at what the other side is doing and hating them, it is not a very good way to spend your life. So, like I write about this stuff, and yet I do try to spend most of my time thinking about more constructive things, taking a hike with my kids, just doing doing things that are enjoyable, right? And just trying to feel positive about what is actually doable, which again, is overall pretty amazing. COVID messed it up a bit, but still, things will go back to normal probably by the end of the year. So I'm looking forward to normality. So that's my version of positive.
My guest today is Bryan Caplan. Bryan, thank you very much for your time.